The dominant view of the mind for the last 300 years of Western philosophy has been one that derives from the French philosopher René Descartes, one of the most influential philosophers of all time. His method is to start looking at questions by asking how an individual can acquire knowledge. He starts, that is, by asking how he knows what he knows. And if you want to see the force of his arguments, you will have to start by asking yourself how you know what you know. The fact that Descartes starts with how he knows things marks him as one of the first modern philosophers. For since Descartes, much of Western philosophy has been based on epistemological considerations. Descartes' best-known work, The Discourse on Method, its full title is actually Discourse on the Method for Properly Conducting Reason and Searching for Truth in the Sciences, is written in a clear, attractive style. This may make what he is saying seem simpler and more obvious than it really is. So we need to consider what he says very carefully. Here is a passage from the fourth part of the discourse, published in 1637, where he sets out very clearly his view of the nature of his own self. Then, examining attentively what I was, and seeing that I could pretend that I had no body, and that there was no world and no place where I was, but that I could not pretend in the same way that I did not exist, and that, to the contrary, just because I was thinking to doubt the truth of other things, it followed quite obviously and quite certainly that I did exist. Whereas, if I had just ceased to think, although everything else that I had ever imagined had been true, I would have had no reason to believe that I existed. I knew from this that I was a substance whose whole essence or nature was only to think, and that had no need for any place to exist and did not depend on any material thing. So that this I, which is to say my mind, through which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from my body, and even that it is easier to know than my body, and further that even if my body did not exist at all, my mind would not cease to be all that it is. This passage contains practically every central component of Descartes' philosophy of mind. First, Descartes is a dualist. This means he believes that a mind and a body are two quite distinct sorts of thing, two kinds of what he calls substance. Second, what he thinks you really are, yourself, is a mind. Since you are your mind, and minds are totally independent of bodies, you could still exist, even without a body. Third, your mind and your thoughts are the things you know best. For Descartes, it is possible, at least in principle, for there to be a mind without a body, unable, however hard it tries, to become aware of anything else, including any other minds. Descartes knew, of course, that the way we do in fact come to know what is happening in other minds is by observing the speech and actions of other bodies. But for him, there were two serious possibilities, each of which would mean that our belief in the existence of other minds was mistaken. One is that these other bodies could be mere figments of our imagination. The other is that even if bodies and other material things do exist, the evidence we normally think justifies our belief that other bodies are inhabited by minds could have been produced by automata, by mindless machines. Fourth, the essence of a mind is to have thoughts, and by thoughts, Descartes means anything that you are aware of in your mind when you are conscious. The essence of a kind of thing, K, is the property vor set of properties, whose possession is a necessary and sufficient condition for membership in K. That is, if something has the essential property E, then it belongs to K. So E is sufficient for membership in K. Anything that doesn't have E doesn't belong to K, so E is necessary for membership. In other places, Descartes says that the essence of a material thing, the property, in other words, every material thing must have, is that it occupies space. This means that for Descartes, the two essential differences between material things and minds are, 1, that minds think, whereas matter does not, and 2, that material things take up space, whereas minds do not. Descartes' claim, then, is that what distinguishes the mind from the body is the negative fact that the mind is not in space and the positive fact that the mind thinks. It is not surprising that Descartes believed that matter does not think. Very few people suppose that stones or tables or atoms have thoughts. But why did he think that minds were not in space? After all, you might think that my mind is where my body is. But if I had no body, as Descartes thought was possible, I would still have a mind. So he couldn't say that a mind must be where its body is, simply because it might not have a body at all. Still, if I do have a body, why shouldn't I say that that is where my mind is? If I didn't have a body, that would be the wrong answer. But as it happens, I do. I think the main reason for thinking that minds are not in space is that it does really seem strange to ask, where are your thoughts? Even if you answered this question by saying, in my head, it would not be obvious that this was literally true. For if they were in your head, you could find out where they were in your head and how large a volume of space they occupied. But you cannot say how many inches long a particular thought is, or how many centimeters wide, or whether it is currently north or south of your cerebral cortex. There is a fifth and final characteristic of this passage that is typical of Descartes' philosophy of mind. Throughout the argument, Descartes insists on beginning with what can be known for certain, what cannot be doubted. He insists, that is, on beginning with an epistemological point of view. These are the major features of Descartes' philosophy of mind, and as I said, this has been the dominant view since his time. So dominant has it been, in fact, that by the mid-20th century, the central problems of the philosophy of mind were reduced, in effect, to two. The first was a problem M made us think about, the problem of other minds. What justifies our belief that other minds exist at all? And the second is the mind-body problem. How are we to explain the relations of a mind and its body? The first of these questions reflects Descartes' epistemological outlook. The second reflects his dualism. Now, it is just this dualism that raises some of the major difficulties of Descartes' position. For anyone who thinks of mind and body as totally distinct needs to offer an answer to two main questions. First, how do mental events cause physical events? How, for example, do our intentions, which are mental, lead to action, which involves physical movements of our bodies? Second, how do physical events cause mental ones? How, for example, is it possible for physical interaction between our eyes and the light to lead to the sensory experiences of vision, which is mental? And, as we shall see, the answer Descartes gives to these questions seems not to be consistent with his explanation of the essential difference between body and mind. Descartes' answer to these questions seems clear and simple enough. The human brain, he thought, was a point of interaction between mind and matter. Indeed, Descartes suggested that the pineal gland in the center of your head was the channel between the two distinct realms of mind and matter. That was his answer to the mind-body question. But this theory comes into conflict with Descartes' claim that what distinguishes the mental from the material is that it is not spatial. For if mental happenings cause happenings in the brain, then doesn't that mean that mental events occur in the brain? How can something cause a happening in the brain unless it is another happening in or near the brain? Normally, when one event, call it A, causes another event, call it B, A and B have to be next to each other, or there has to be a chain of events that are next to each other, which runs from A to B. The drama in the television studio causes the image on my TV screen miles away. But there is an electromagnetic field that carries the image from the studio to me, a field that is in space between my TV and the studio. Descartes' view has to be that my thoughts cause changes in my brain and that these changes then lead to my actions. But if the thoughts aren't in or near my brain, and if there's no chain of events between my thoughts and my brain, then this is a very unusual brand of causation. Descartes wants to say that thoughts aren't anywhere, but according to him, at least some of the effects of my thoughts are in my brain, and none of the direct effects of my thoughts are in anybody else's brain. My thoughts regularly lead to my actions and never lead directly to someone else's. We have now reached one central problem for Descartes' position, for it is normal to think that things are where their effects originate. We can call this the causal account of location. And on this view, my thoughts are in my brain, which is the origin of my behavior. But if mental events occur in the brain, then since the brain is in space, at least some mental events are in space also. And then Descartes' way of distinguishing the mental and the material won't work. Let's call this apparent conflict between, A, the fact that mind and matter do seem to interact causally, and B, Descartes' claim that the mind is not in space. Descartes' problem. Once you accept the causal account of location, there are four main ways you might try to deal with this problem. The first would be to deny that causes and their effects have to be in space. Descartes is only one of the possible dualist solutions to the mind-body question that takes this approach, because he thinks that mental and material events interact even if only in the brain. His view is called interactionism. But if you want to keep Descartes' view that the mind is not in space, and if you do not think that causes and effects of events in space have themselves to be in space, you might also try one of the other forms of dualism. There are two kinds of dualism you might try in which the causation goes only one way. You could hold either that mental events have bodily causes but not bodily effects, or that mental events have material effects but no material causes. Each of these positions deserves consideration, but each of these two kinds of dualism claims that minds are both causally active in space and yet somehow not in space themselves. As a result, they need to offer some way of thinking about causation that is very unlike the way we normally think about it. A second way out of Descartes' problem is to deny that there are any causal connections between mind and matter at all. On this view, there are corresponding material and mental realms, which run in parallel without any causal interaction. Psychophysical parallelism, as this theory is called, certainly escapes Descartes' problem. But we are left with a mystery. Why do the mind and the body work together if there is no interaction between them? Psychophysical parallelism says mind and body run in parallel without explaining why. The third way out of Descartes' problem would be to try a different way of distinguishing mind and matter. If you think that both causes and their effects have to be in space and that mental events have material causes or effects, you cannot maintain Descartes' claim that minds are not spatial. Starting with some new way of distinguishing mind and matter, however, you might still be able to keep dualism while taking into account the fact that causes have to be in space if their effects are. But however you distinguish the mental and the material, if you believe they are two different kinds of thing, you will have to face the other mind's problem. If your mind and body are utterly distinct kinds of thing, how can I know anything about your mind, since all I can see or hear or touch is your body? You brush off the fly, and I judge that you want to get rid of it. But if there is no necessary connection between what your body does and what is going on in your mind, how is this judgment justified? How can I know your body isn't just an automaton, a machine that reacts mechanically with no intervening mental processes? If you find this thought compelling, you might want to try a solution to Descartes' problem that is not dualist at all. So the fourth and last way out of Descartes' problem is just to give up the idea that mind and matter really are distinct kinds of thing, and thus to become what philosophers call a monist. Monism is the view that reality consists of only one kind of thing. For monists, beliefs and earthquakes are just things in the world. Things in the world can interact causally with each other, so there's nothing surprising about my belief that there's a table in my way, causing me to move the table. The movement of the table is partly caused by the belief. That's no more surprising than a movement of the table caused by an earthquake. I've suggested that thinking about the other mind's problem might lead you to give up dualism. And if you consider the very evident fact that we do know that other people have minds, you may be led, with many 20th century philosophers and psychologists, to the form of monism called behaviorism. Behaviorism, which we noticed as one possible response to the problem of deciding whether a computer could have a mind, is simply the identification of the mind with certain bodily dispositions. A behaviorist, then, is someone who believes that to have a mind is to be disposed to behave in certain ways in response to input. On one behaviorist view, for example, for English speakers to believe that something is red is for them to be disposed to say, "It is red," or to reply with a yes if asked the question, "Is it red?" And dispositions like this are a familiar part of the world. Being sharp is, roughly, being disposed to cut if pressed against a surface. Being fragile is, roughly, being disposed to break if dropped. There's a strong contrast between behaviorism and Descartes' view. Descartes thought belief was a private matter. That had two consequences. First, that you know for sure what you believe. Second, that only you know for sure what you believe. And the trouble with Descartes' view of the mind is that it makes it very hard to see how we can know about other minds at all. For the behaviorist, on the other hand, belief is a disposition to act in response to your environment. If you respond in the way that is appropriate for someone with a certain belief, that's evidence that you have it. Since your response is public, visible, and audible, others can find out what you believe. Indeed, as the English philosopher Gilbert Ryle argued in his book, The Concept of Mind, we sometimes find out what we ourselves believe by noticing our own behavior. It is a big step from saying that some of our mental states are things that other people can know about, to saying with the behaviorists that all of them must be in this way public. Yet, one of the most influential philosophical arguments of recent years has just this conclusion. The argument was made by the Austrian-born philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein.